The most common contractual mistakes, episode 6, e-commerce and examples from Singapore and Vietnam, part of the series Global Business Law in 20 Minutes with Federico Fasoli. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent. Hi, everyone. This is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney, mediator, and arbitrator working throughout Florida and Texas.
And Natalia Łowska-Czajka, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator based in Warsaw, Poland.
And Federico Fasoli, Italian lawyer, managing partner of the MTV, with offices in Singapore, Vietnam, and Malta.
All right, guys. So topic for today is to talk about e-commerce and specifically to dive down into what is going on in the e-commerce world, specifically in Vietnam and Singapore. So when we think about e-commerce, we think of the likes of eBay and Amazon, basically any platform that allows for parties to transact business over the internet. All right. We think of purchasing goods and services and all sorts of things. Anyway, from what I understand, e-commerce is booming in Asia. And we got Federico here today to discuss a little bit about this trend. So, Federico, why don't you open us up into this topic?
Thank you very much, Mac. Yes, the pandemic has been an accelerator in many instances. And e-commerce is strong in Southeast Asia. I don't want to be self-referential, but as you might know, as our viewers know, I work extensively in Singapore and Vietnam. And revenues in the e-commerce market is projected to reach really high values in those countries. In Vietnam, it is projected to reach $7 billion this year, 2021. Vietnam, for those of you that don't know, is a country that is home to about 100 million people, a bit less than 100 million people, 97 million people, something like that. Singapore, on the contrary, is a very small country, is a city-state, home to 5.5, 6 million people, more or less. And e-commerce is projected to reach about $3 billion in 2021. So it is large industries, not huge yet. We're not talking about the energy market or top markets, but still it is an area that is worth considering, especially considering the legal implication that considers. So let me give you a few more raw data for our viewers. In both countries, and I guess it is the same pretty much everywhere, the market's largest segment is electronics and media, with a projected market value of over $500 million US dollars in 2021 for Singapore, and almost $2 billion US dollars in Vietnam. And user penetration is expected to be almost 56% in 2021, up to 67.2% by 2025 in Singapore, whilst in Vietnam, user penetration is projected to be 52.7%, so very similar to Singapore. In 2021 is expected to hit 70% by 2025. So what I'm trying to say with all these numbers, you can re-listen to all these numbers. I know it is difficult to memorize them. I myself struggle when somebody mention numbers so quickly. But essentially what I'm trying to say is it is a big industry and it is projected to be more and more important. Therefore, legal implications would be more and more important.
Thank you. And can you tell us, therefore, what the trends are? So what is really catchy there and what differentiates this market from what we have here in Europe or from what you know about the States?
The main difference is the players. So especially in Vietnam, Singapore is much more similar to the Western world. So I wouldn't see, except for a few names in the market, I wouldn't see striking differences. Whilst the big difference, I don't know whether I am myself outdated or not, but the main difference that I see in Vietnam is that social networks, primarily Facebook and Instagram, in Vietnam are used as search engines. So they're not really used to interact with other users. They're used to promote oneself. So, especially Instagram celebrities, Instagrammers, influencers, people in fashion, etc. They try and, of course, promote their images over these instruments. But the average user who's not a fashion model, a TV presenter, or anything as such, uses Facebook and Instagram as a search engine. So, are you looking for? We're talking offline earlier about Italian food in Vietnam. Well, if you're looking for a good Italian restaurant or good Italian food delivery in Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City, you would the average Vietnamese user would go on Facebook rather than Google, for instance, or Bing or other search engines that we're more accustomed to, at least here in Europe and most likely in the US. So instead of Googling it, we actually have a word for it to Google something. They would Facebook it, and so it is essential for players. The take of this piece of news for those of you listening and watching to this show, to this episode, is if you are thinking about operating in Vietnam online, make sure that your Facebook page and your Instagram page, it is pretty much the same. They are easy to use, they're user friendly, and you can purchase your products and services through your Facebook and Instagram channels because it is more direct than it is in Europe and in the West. That is my feeling. Then, of course, you have a number of platforms that are typical of that part of the world. Even in Singapore, for instance, Amazon is not as strong as in other parts of the world. I would say that Lazada is probably the number one e-commerce platform in Singapore. Same in Vietnam. In Vietnam, you also have local platforms like Tiki Vietnam, which is specialized in electronics. And but more or less the dynamics are very similar to what we're accustomed to in the West.
Thank you. So think about how Yelp, for example, which is pretty big here in the US, it's a place where you can go get reviews on anything practically, especially food, right? I mean, restaurants are big on Yelp. But like you said a second ago, this trend toward using social and social connectivity to gen up business and to present yourself to the public. I think that is something that's happening more and more here as well. Because, for example, Yelp is not just a place you go and you get reviews, but it's also a place where people can interact, people can comment, and then chime in on certain businesses. So I guess businesses are just kind of smart. E-commerce businesses are smart in figuring out, hey, we got to tap into this public consciousness of everyone trying to, get together on the same page and talk about things and share and follow. So let's say you are a business and you want to tap into this e-commerce market that's out in Singapore and Vietnam. What are some legal aspects, some things you consider legally to make sure that you do things right?
Our series is called In 20 Minutes, so we have to keep it short. There are a lot, of course, of legal aspects. We are focusing on contracts in this series, so evidently, anything that has to do with consumer protection, so even contracts with consumers, is fundamental. So if you are a US-based business or a European-based business and want to sell through, say, Facebook, to Vietnamese consumers or through Lazada in Singapore, you have to make sure that you have proper agreements in place. Naturally, they would be one-sided. There would be your own agreements, but they have to comply with the law. So contract law is huge. I'm not going too much into details, but that is just one main topic, and it's already huge. The other aspects that I would consider are, of course, data protection. In Singapore, there is a Personal Data Protection Act. It's called PDPA. Singaporeans love acronyms. That sets 9 bullet points to follow. It is pretty standard. This is similar to what you have in California, to what you have in Europe with the GDPR, etc. But essentially, the 9 points are consent. So consent for to the transfer of data, notification. That is, if you are the data the data officer, you need to notify users of what is going to happen with the data, whether you're changing servers, whether you're changing policies, etc. So notification purpose. What is the purpose of retainment of data? Accuracy. Data should be kept in an accurate way. They should be truthful. They should be accurate. They should be complete, etc. Protection. Data should be protected according to the highest standards in cybersecurity. This is very important, to the extent that, of course, there are some standards related to the physical infrastructure that you use in order to protect your data, how often you change your passwords, what your mobile policy is. I was recently involved in a case where a client of mine that operates online was asked by the authorities in Singapore when making an application what mobile policy they had, meaning if they use instant messaging services to exchange information within the same company, between employees, for instance, what policy they have in order to retain those messages. For instance, who is going to see those, who is able to see those messages? How often do you update the instant messaging services? For how long you're going to keep those messages? Who is in charge of checking that employees follow the rules, and so on and so forth. So this is very important in Singapore. So 6, retention, for how long you're going to keep the user's data, and how. 7, assessment and correction. 8, transfer. So if you're going to transfer data outside of Singapore, you have to notify users. And of course, accountability. So who's responsible for what happens in case something goes wrong? Now, Vietnam at the moment doesn't have a data protection legislation, but they have already drafted a decree that consolidates existing norms and introducing severe penalties in the system. So the existing norms include the Constitution, of course, of general principles of law, the law on cybersecurity, the civil code, the law on electronic transactions, law on information technology, law on telecommunications, and so on and so forth. So there is a number of pieces of legislation that coexist, and these pieces of legislation will be consolidated in this decree, but it's not out yet. But essentially, the principles will be pretty much the same as the ones that I have mentioned for Singapore, with a stress on national defense, social order, security, and safety of Vietnam. This is quite important. So the second aspect after contracts is, of course, performance, is of course, to abide by data protection legislation in any country, really, not just Singapore and Vietnam, but this is very important. And to abide by the local legislation on e-commerce, because there are concurrent pieces of legislation that regulate this industry. For instance, in Vietnam, a foreign investor, you mentioned some very famous international players, must be included in the so-called list of globally reputable technology companies engaged in the e-commerce industry. And that is periodically published by the Ministry of Industry and Trade, the MOIT. So investors that are not listed, so if you have an e-commerce platform, say in America, in Europe, wherever, outside of Vietnam anyway, that is not listed in such list, you're not permitted to invest in Vietnamese e-commerce companies. So you can trade, but you cannot invest. You cannot say, well, I like that platform, I would like to take over some shares of it. No, you cannot. You have to go through an appraisal procedures, which is quite complicated. And foreign platforms, regardless of what I just said, are captured by the system. So if you are Yelp, as you mentioned, or if you are whatever other player that does not have a legal entity in Vietnam, I don't know in the case of Yelp, to be honest, but if you don't have a legal entity in Vietnam, then your entity established abroad is captured. That is, it is subject to Vietnamese laws if it operates in Vietnam. You have to have guarantees on payment on transactions, on refund policies and so on. You have to cooperate with the authorities. So there is really a lot. Not to mention taxes such as VAT. GST is called in Singapore, but it's pretty much the same. If you sell to the European Union, so let me change continent for a while, there is the EU VAT directive. We talked about directives a while ago when we discussed agency agreements. So if you sell to consumers, if you're a business, say in America, in the Middle East, wherever outside of the European Union, and you sell B2C, so business to consumers, then most of the times you are subject to EU VAT, depending on the country, on the member state that you sell to. So I don't know what the VAT rate, the normal VAT rate is in Poland. In Italy, it is 22%, if I'm not mistaken. In Malta, it is 18%. So depending where the consumer, the buyer is, you will be subject to that tax, which has to be included in the final price. It has to be clear. You have to state in the invoice that X is the price plus 18% if you're operating in Malta, and so on. So there is really a lot to digest. I know that I've given you a super long answer, but the point is there is a lot to digest in every country that you operate, because at the end of the day, e-commerce is like any other international business. You're subject to local laws. And considering that it is so easy to operate transnationally, then you're subject to a multitude of pieces of legislation. So it's complicated.
Back to the VAT rates, Poland has 23% general rate. Of course, you have also things that are, well, services that are exempted, or sometimes you also can, like for construction, you can exceptionally have 8%. So it differs. But what I wanted to ask you is really in the e-commerce, because of its massive usage, the consumer protection is really something that plays a big role. And within the European Union, again, we have directives on it. And how does it work in Singapore, in Vietnam? Is there, for example, because as a consequence of the consumer protection, we have laws that practically say that you can get rid of a part of a contract if it doesn't comply with the consumer protection law, and then it will be replaced by relevant legislation. How does it work there?
Pretty much the same in both countries. Naturally, we have to assess this with the efficacy and efficiency of the judicial system in Vietnam. But the principles are pretty much the same. The point is consumers are protected and must be protected. And this is very important, for instance, when it comes to the possibility for consumers to return the goods. And they have up to 14 days in Europe, and the same in many other jurisdictions, including China, for instance. One wouldn't think about it, to return goods. And that opens yet another huge chapter, which is that of intellectual property right protection. That is, if you sell online, of course, you need to protect your trademarks, your IP rights. And the problem that we witness in certain Asian markets with consumer protection is that sometimes these measures are abused. They're taken advantage of. That is, some sneaky consumers that are in fact criminals, they use the possibility to return the goods after 14 days in order to make counterfeit copies of such goods within the time span. So essentially what they do is they return the fake copy and they keep the original and they get a refund. It is something that happens in China quite often. It happens in many other jurisdictions. I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, just to be clear, but it is something that you should consider, even in Europe, in America, etc., because it is actually something that is happening. So on top of all the many things that I have mentioned, intellectual property rights is also yet another aspect to take into account when dealing with e-commerce.
Thank you. So, Federico, we're going to be wrapping it up right now. Thank you again for your words on the topic of e-commerce, especially in Singapore and Vietnam. So, next time, we'll continue on with more about contracts. Appreciate your time. Take care.
Thank you. You too. Take care. Thank you all.
Bye.